This video is on autism and empathy. What do we mean by empathy when we talk about autistic people having empathy or lacking empathy? So I'll have a general discussion about autism and empathy, then I'll outline how empathy has various different aspects, then I'll consider how we should understand autism and empathy given these various aspects of empathy. So here's a problem. Lots of people, especially scientists, have argued that autistic people lack empathy or have significantly reduced empathy. Whereas, in contrast, lots of autistic individuals have argued that they do not lack empathy. Indeed, some autistic people have argued it's offensive to say that autistic people lack empathy. What exactly do we mean by empathy? What do those people who think autistic people lack empathy mean by empathy? And what do those autistic people who say they do not lack empathy mean by empathy? One problem with this is that empathy is very difficult to define, and I'm going to discuss various different aspects of empathy. So, for example, a recent study has looked at papers on empathy and autism. It looked at 111 different papers and it found 31 unique conceptual interpretations of empathy that diverged across 12 dimensions. In other words, the scientific papers on empathy would often use quite different definitions on empathy. But also, it's worth noting that what is arguably the most popular account of empathy held by autistic individuals, the double empathy problem, that also, according to a recent paper, intriguingly steers clear of defining empathy. So I think it's plausible to say that both in relation to scientists and in relation to autistic people, we can certainly say, what exactly do you mean by empathy? It's not immediately clearly obvious as to what it means and what it entails, and how one approach to empathy differs from another approach. A distinction is sometimes made between cognitive empathy and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy relates to perspective taking, whereas affective empathy broadly relates to emotion. So imagine if you are forming an empathetic relationship with somebody else, that being you are in a state of empathy in relation to someone else. This could be cognitive empathy, whereby you're trying to understand their perspective, or it could be affective empathy, whereby it relates to the emotions you are feeling. These are two different definitions. Scientists have disagreed upon which of these autistic people might lack. The most well known account of autistic people lacking empathy is theory of mind deficits, as developed by Simon Baron-Cohen. But on that account, it only relates to cognitive empathy, the idea that autistic people struggle to see the perspective of other people. Baron-Cohen actually thought autistic people did not lack affective empathy. Now, historically, autism science has mainly looked at cognitive empathy, but a recent study of 35 articles on autism and empathy by scientists, psychologists typically, found that generally both cognitive and affective empathy are reduced in autistic people. So I'm not saying those studies are correct, I'm just saying that there's been disagreement as to which of these is lacking in autistic people among scientists. But if we look at enough articles, generally the indication is that both of them are lacking. Cognitive and affective empathy are still too broad. They're still covering too many things that makes it difficult to really understand what is being established if we establish that autistic people do or do not lack cognitive or affective empathy. So I'm going to consider an account of empathy that is more fine-grained. So I'm taking it from this book, Empathy, Philosophical and Psychological Perspectives, edited by Amy Copland and Peter Goldie. I'm particularly interested in an article by Amy Copland, one of the editors, which I'm going to use to outline how there are 6 different elements to empathy. Now, it's worth noting this is only the account that Amy gives. There are other ways of understanding empathy. I'm not saying this one is the best, I just think it's a good starting point. Additionally, some of these distinctions which are being made by Amy, you can also find in other articles. Not all the same six, but at least some of these distinctions can be found in some of the other articles in the book. So Amy outlines 6 different aspects to empathy, which I'm going to describe in turn. So the first 3 relate to emotion. Firstly, feeling what someone else feels. If someone else is in emotional pain, you feel that exact same pain or a very similar pain. If someone is angry, you feel that anger, the exact anger, or a very similar anger. You directly pick up on the emotions that they have. Secondly, being emotionally affected by someone else's emotions and experiences, but not necessarily experiencing the same emotion. So, on this account, you do have an emotional response, but you don't feel the same as someone else feels. So, if someone else is in pain in front of you, you might yourself get upset that they are in pain, but you're not feeling the same pain. You're upset because they are upset, but that doesn't mean you're feeling the exact same pain that they are having. You might be upset in a different way. So if they are upset because, say, they've lost a close family member, they're getting one specific set of feelings. You're upset for them because you don't want them to be upset. That doesn't mean you're feeling the exact same emotions as somebody who has lost a family member. On the second account, you're feeling emotion, but not the exact same emotion as a person in front of you, unlike the first account. Thirdly, caring about someone. You feel some type of emotional attachment to someone, and how they feel is important to you. Now, that's distinct from the first and second ones because you can care about someone, they can feel in pain, and you can have no emotional reaction. For example, imagine if you cared about someone and they're in pain, but they're in pain because they hurt you or they let you down. They did something which you warned them not to do because it was not in their interest to do it, and they did it anyway. So you care about them, but you think maybe they deserve to be in pain, so you don't get upset. So those are 3 different ways that empathy can relate to emotion, but they're all different. The next 3 criteria relate to perspective taking. The first one is imagining yourself in someone else's situation. So if someone else is in pain because, say, they've lost their parents, you imagine what you would be like if you were in that situation. You imagine what you would be like if you lost your parents. So you are considering a different perspective, but it's you in that different perspective. So that's the 4th criteria. On the 5th criteria, you imagine being someone else in the other person's perspective. So whereas on the 4th criteria, you imagined what you would be like if you lost your parents, if there's someone in front of you who's lost their parents. On the 5th criteria, you imagine what it would be like to be the other person in front of you who's lost their parents, rather than imagining what you were like if you'd lost your parents. Now, this is a crucial distinction because, for example, imagine if you weren't close to your parents, but the person who's just lost them was close to their parents. You losing your parents might not affect you that much because you weren't close to them, whereas someone else losing their parents might affect them a lot because they were close to them. So, on this 5th criteria, you need to say, what would it be like to lose my parents if I was very close to them? So, you take on the characteristics of the other person. So the 6th one is making inferences about someone else's mental state. So, for example, if someone is crying in front of you, you make the inference that they're crying because they're really happy or they're really upset, that sort of thing. Generally, you'd have much more information than this. They might tell you why they're upset, so you then make inferences as to how exactly the situation they're in creates a specific type of feeling in their head or thought in their head. Now, whether the 6th one involving inferences is different to 4 and 5, that might depend upon whether you subscribe to a notion called theory or simulation theory, which is a way of understanding someone else's mind. So, in what way does all these different aspects of empathy, which I have outlined, relate to notions of empathy more broadly? We could say that there's one thing called empathy, but it's got many different aspects. Alternatively, we could say that actually there's no one thing called empathy, there's instead lots of different things, for example, those six aspects, but they can sometimes coexist together and often do. That's a very broad philosophical question. I'd probably be in favour of the second one, but ultimately, my main point is it just shows how complicated notions of empathy are. Secondly, how do each of the different components relate to one another? Specifically, how does scoring high or low on one aspect impact other aspects? For example, could someone score really high on one of the six aspects, even though they don't score particularly highly on any of the others? Or alternatively, are there some that you have to score highly on to score highly on the others? So, for example, can you score high on the ones relating to emotion without scoring high on the ones relating to perspective taking, or are in fact they related, whereby you cannot score highly on those relating to emotion without scoring highly on those relating to perspective taking? My general suspicion is this is going to differ between different people. So some people are going to have to score highly on some to get high scores on the others. Whereas for other people, I suspect that's not going to be the case. So that shows again the complexity of notions of empathy. Now let's relate all this back to autism. Do autistic people lack empathy or not? I think that question is too broad. I think we need to understand how autistic people score on each of the aspects. I think that's a much more useful way, because you could have a situation where autistic people score very highly on some aspects and very low on other aspects. That's potentially possible. Now, how do I feel autistic people do in relation to various components? Well, here I'm going to draw upon my own experience of being autistic and also the experience of knowing some other people who are autistic personally. Obviously, exactly how generalizable these views are, that can be debated, but this is my view based upon mainly my own experiences of myself and other autistic people I've known. Firstly, feeling what someone else feels. So, feeling the same emotions as someone else, or the very nearly same emotions. That I have very limited ability to do. There can be somebody I care about who's upset, who's in pain, and I get upset that they're in pain, but I don't feel the same emotion they feel. I might feel basically nothing beyond, I wish this person wasn't in pain. I don't then mirror their emotions in a way which, at least according to many accounts of empathy I've read about, can often happen. Additionally, of all the autistic people I've known personally, they've either said they can't do this, or they've given no reason for me to believe that they could do this. So, again, autism is a very broad diagnosis. There could certainly be autistic people who can do this, but I also think there's some who can't. And to my mind, I think that's pretty important. I would like other people to recognize that I cannot do this. And so if an autistic person says it's offensive to say autistic people lack empathy, then to my mind, that's actually concealing something that I feel I do have a genuine lack of. Secondly, perspective taking. I think this one's complicated because I'm inclined to say autistic people could be both worse and better at this. So, autistic people can sometimes struggle to see other perspectives. In relation to myself, it's not automatic for me to sort of think, oh, that person's got a different perspective to me. How might they be feeling? So, in that regard, I'd be inclined to say I'm worse at perspective taking. However, when I actually try and make an effort to perspective take, to imagine someone else's perspective, I feel I spend quite a lot of time trying to work out what might be going on, and I'd be tempted to say more time than most people. And I try to reflect upon who they are, what situation they're in, and how that might be affecting them. I do this in a conscious, reflective way, whereas it looks to me like a lot of people will do this in a more unconscious way. So, in that regard, if I'm willing to make an effort, I suspect I might actually be relatively good at perspective taking. So, I think it's going to depend upon the way in which we go about doing perspective taking. Sometimes autistic people might be worse, sometimes they could be better. Finally, we have the concern that if you lack empathy, you lack morality. Well, to my mind, that doesn't work because plenty of autistic people care about lots of stuff. However, again, on my observations, it seems to me they sometimes take a different approach to morality. It seems to me to be less based upon emotion and more based upon reason and rationality. So they're often quite, for example, rule bound and inflexible when it comes to morality. It's a philosophical question as to which approach is better, one based more on emotion and feeling versus one based on thought and rules. But I would personally be inclined to say the latter one. I could be biased here, but reflection and thought and following rules is actually often quite a good approach to morality. To conclude, I think there's a lot of imprecision when someone says autistic people do lack empathy or don't lack empathy, and I think being more specific would help. Additionally, I am inclined to say that I, at least, in some sense, lack some aspects of empathy, and I think that's quite important, and I think that can be concealed when someone says autistic people don't lack empathy. But at the same time, there are aspects of empathy which I feel I can do, and so that's concealed when someone says autistic people do lack empathy. This is the bibliography, so articles which I cited. Thank you for listening.